Comrades, friends, welcome to another edition of Redline TV. I'm very pleased to have with us today my fellow comrades from the editorial team. My name is Mike Cowley, and I have with me today Jackie Walker and Graham Bash. We're going to be talking about another turbulent week in British and global politics. And Jackie, I'm going to start with you if I can. We've seen this week the David Miller verdict. We have seen anti-Zionism now with a judicial precedent regarded as a protected opinion within workplaces. We've seen articles saying the kind of things that would once and maybe still would get you expelled from the Labour Party, that the Israeli state has been weaponising anti-Semitism. And of course, what has pushed all this is both the courage and determination of the Palestinian people, but the global solidarity movements around them. I wonder, Jackie, with the verdict, with the International Criminal Court of Justice verdict also, are we reaching some kind of tipping point in terms of how Israel is appraised and how anti-Semitism is appraised the world over?
I'm going to make a really awkward response, which is yes and no. I think if you're talking about civil society, I've got no doubt that Israel has done itself huge damage. We've got to the actual point when even people like Biden and Cameron are saying, actually, this is all getting too much. We're also getting to the point where, in terms of Israel, people like Biden and Cameron are being called anti-Semites. Welcome to the community of anti-Semites. But it's all becoming a bit of a joke. And I think there are, I mean, like I've often said about this, and I said it when the Labour Party witch hunt started, that I could not have raised awareness in any way the same as what's happened in the last few months since October the 7th. So I think there are people who are properly horrified. That recent story of the 6-year-old girl who was left calling for help, surrounded by her dead relatives in a car. And, you know, when an ambulance was sent for her, Israeli forces blew up the ambulance, and they've now found the ambulance with the rotting remains of the ambulance people, the little girl, you know, and she was phoning, and the Israeli forces were being begged to allow somebody to go and help that child. And you know what nobody can deny is if that had been an Israeli child in that car, a Jewish Israeli child, that would not have occurred. And if you want to understand how race, ethnicity is at the bottom of this, that's all you've got to think of. Would the IDF have allowed an Israeli 6-year-old to go through what that child went through? Now, there's no doubt in my mind that for particularly people who don't know that much about what's been going on, I think there are, you know, a lot of people who are properly horrified. Then you have the, you know, the extremists, and anyone on social media will know them, and they're the people who will literally say, we don't care, and kill as many children as you like because it's worth it. And I love the way they say that. We think it's worth it. So these are Israelis and Zionists who believe that they can judge that it's worth, doesn't matter however many children. So that has happened. Interestingly, also, the protests, the demonstrations, I have no doubt have shifted what is going on with our politicians. Very interestingly, with the upcoming by-election in Rochdale in particular, today, there is a remarkable change of tone in what Starmer is saying. He's almost saying we need a ceasefire now. because they are, they're not scared of losing the election because of this. But there's more to politics than whether you become the leading party or not. And they have lost a lot of credibility in this. So, yeah, that's my answer.
There's parallels, isn't there? Most folk watching the show, ourselves here, I cut my teeth in the anti-apartheid movement, and there are parallels, aren't there? Because the same courage of ordinary South Africans played out on our television every night, being attacked by the South African state, and just the demonstration of that courage, particularly very young people, kind of contributed anyway to turning the narrative around, so that the South African state eventually was successfully framed, and rightly so, as a rogue state, as an authoritarian and violent racist state. Graham, I just wonder, on Jackie's reference to Rochdale there, we're seeing, it looks like that there's money. Where the money's coming from, I guess we'll find out in good time, but there seems to be an awful lot of money going towards challenges within a lot of different constituencies, and a lot of planning and organisation going into challenging sitting Labour MPs. We know of the George Galloway challenge. I suspect we would have qualified views about George's challenge, given his politics and his history. But politically, Graham, might we also look back on this period as a tipping point for Starmer as well? It's unlikely, as Jackie alluded to, that they're going to do anything but crawl into office in the next general election, but they're going to arrive there with very little credibility, moral or political capital. Might we look back in this as a period where Starmer's credibility and that of the Labour government was already lost before it entered office?
Yes, is the answer. Yes. I think that what we're seeing is the breakdown of Muslim support, which was taken for granted, just like Black Afro-Caribbean support, just taken for granted, and their needs and wishes totally downgraded. I think it's a critical moment. And the Rochdale by-election, like you, Mike, I have the deepest criticisms of George Galloway, and I can go through them on another occasion if you like. On the other hand, that Rochdale by-election is going to be a referendum on the Gaza war. And just one other thing, by the way, about what Jackie was saying. We're seeing this growing divide, aren't we, between the people on the streets in their millions and millions throughout the world and the governments. And I think there's a danger possibly of overstating this Biden, Cameron, Sunak whinging on the sidelines. The fact is, they could stop this tomorrow. If they withheld arms, they withheld finance. And so that's the crucial thing, in my opinion. Yep, I think it could be a tipping point. But what we're going to see is a process. It's not a tipping point that is going to resolve itself, work its way through until Labour comes to office, which they will. And I think that even John Rentoul in today's Independent says that Starmer's already in crisis. He's going to have a tough time when he gets to office. The economic crisis, the loss of his basic support, the alienation of the trade unions. It's in that period, the early period perhaps, of a Starmer government that so many of these issues will come to fruition. So I'm not necessarily for jumping the gun. For instance, I think we should remain in the Labour Party. I can't, I'm expelled, but I think other people should, on the basis that this is where an arena of struggle, not the main arena, but an arena of struggle is going undoubtedly to occur in that early period of the Starmer government.
We spoke a wee moment ago about the tipping point potentially for how the world views the Palestine-Israel conflict. So to both of you, might there be potentially anyway wider ramifications of this, because the Israeli state, as we know, has only been allowed to operate with impunity because it exists within a certain world order that extends that impunity to it? Might we be seeing that? I've heard some voices saying that not only is this going to not end well for Israel, and there's a danger in that conversation, of course, we shouldn't privilege the fate of the colonial aggressor over the fate of they aggressed on. But might there be trouble ahead for the global order more generally that has been sustaining Israel? So Jackie first, and then Graham's thoughts.
I've got no doubt about that. This is something we hear very little about, but I happen to be one of those people who sleeps very little. So I listen to the World Service quite a lot. And what you're getting there, without doubt, is a sort of denial of Euro-America's moral authority. It's gone. It's absolutely gone. They have actually, and you know, this is there's a moral capital that Europeans held to themselves in terms of how you behave and, you know, the policing of the world, and particularly America, but the same for the UK and other European powers. That has gone. And what you're also seeing is other alliances. So, for example, both China and Russia, whatever we think of those regimes, have come out very strongly and very critically in terms of Israel. And there is a new kind of alliance going on. I mean, this is the beginnings of it, but I have no doubt that this has done Euro-America a huge amount of damage, and it matters.
And Graham, yourself, where do you see this leading?
Well, moral authority, of course, matters an immense amount, but America and its European allies still hold an enormous power. Of course, American hegemony is now under challenge like never before. But the danger is, let's look a year ahead. It is possible, even more than possible, that Trump will be president, which would be a disaster for the world, a disaster for those fighting Israel, because if you think Biden's soft on Israel, you wait till we get Trump. So it's to be resolved. And the danger, of course, is in Britain, as we said, with a Starmer government in crisis from almost day one, in my opinion, this could lead to the development not only of that movement from below on our side, but also a movement of the far right. As these, I mean, after all, what's happening in Israel, Palestine, in a sense, is a form of kind of a racial divide, white supremacism versus the rest of the world. And I'm worried about what will happen in Britain. It's strange in a way, because, I mean, I look at my part of the communities of which I was part, the Jewish community, and in fact, although of course JVL and lots of other left-wing groups getting together in the Jewish bloc on the demonstrations played a wonderful role, but we are a very much a minority in Britain, whereas probably I think that the situation amongst the Jewish community in America is actually a more hopeful one, where that divide is far greater. I'm sure there's a number of reasons for that, which could be explored again in another program.
And just to pick that up, Graham, you've spoken before about your, if you don't mind me saying that, your hurt, if that's the right word, of being ostracized from your community because of your politics. We've seen, I think we've spoken about it before amongst ourselves, the tragedy of the Israeli state demanding absolute compliance and loyalty from the Jewish diaspora in terms of their hegemony in the region, and the contrast that exposes of the very best traditions within the Jewish community involved, of course, in the civil rights movement, trade union movement, the Russian Revolution, huge historical events that the Jewish community as a marginalised and repressed community have been to the fore of very often. We saw some really troubling, to put it mildly, pictures recently of Israeli flags next to Union Jack flags in a demonstration in London, and I think we all agreed if we'd tinted those black and white, they would have looked like something from the 1970s when the far right was mobilising. Graham first, and then Jackie, what do you make of that development? Are we overstating that fear that the far right populism, which we know is simmering in British politics and European politics, may well find common cause with supporters of the Israeli state?
Yes, but your question has so many layers, so I do need a bit of time to develop what I respond to that. It's a political tragedy, as well as, for me, a personal tragedy. It's a political tragedy. Look back 100 years. What was the most radical part of the population in this country? Very arguably, you could say it was the Jewish communist proletariat in this country. 100 years later, on the whole, and there's huge exceptions to this, so we don't buy the monolith portrayed by the Jewish Chronicle, but overall, you can say now that the Jewish population in this country is arguably one of the most reactionary parts of the population. Now, it's a personal tragedy. It's not just I feel ostracized from the community. That's the easy bit. I'm ostracized from my own family. Or rather, I don't know, you could say who's ostracized who, but I mean, it's an impossible situation. The divide has occurred. And I just want to look back at this because I was brought up in that transitional period, immediately in the shadow of the Holocaust. I was brought up on the tragedy that had occurred in Europe to Europe's Jews. I was brought up with that, and I was also brought up with those traditions of anti-racism, Cable Street, and all the struggles of the early period. And not just in Britain, by the way. There's a wonderful book called, what is it called? Revolutionary Yiddish Land, that talks about the Bund and other sections of the left where Jews were prominent. And it is a tragedy because I was brought up by my dad, who was anti-racist, was at Cable Street, all of that kind of thing. And yet, within that separation, there was something that was already going on that made you feel separate, but also special. And, you know, just look back at that period. And for instance, I think it's true to say that I suffered anti-Semitism at school, and that was external to me. But it became internalized, and I felt separate. I felt on the margins, and it was that Jewish influence, if you like, the influence of my being brought up as a young Jewish boy in that period, that made me anti-racist, that made me kind of join the Labour movement, join the Labour Party, and I become a Marxist at the age of 19. But even then, that kind of that experience didn't just disappear when I become a Marxist. Okay, I'm no longer a Jew. Not that easy. That feeling of being a bit special lasted years after I became a Marxist. And already I can think of even my dad, great bloke that he was. I remember it was a personal tragedy for me in a way. In 1973, the war, I wasn't living at home, and he phones me up and said, where do you stand? I said, I support the Arabs, I support Egypt. And he said, I don't want to hear from you. And that was terrible. I felt totally broken from the family. It healed, but it comes to the fore whenever there is a tragedy like this. And at the moment, I'm out of speaking terms with my family. So, yeah, I think there's all sorts of, but that's not, there was wonderful traditions I was brought up with. Universalist, internationalist, but within that, there was something more, and there was a feeling of separateness, specialness, and I think that really has to be broken down. And thank goodness for the JVO and all the other organisations of the Jewish left in this country, which means that we do not just speak as isolated individuals.
Jackie, I was just reading, I've just finished reading Primo Levi's The Drowned and the Saved, and towards the end of the book, he says something which a lot in the book struck me because it's such an eloquent testimonial, but he warns against future Holocausts, essentially, something that you're almost not allowed to do in Israel. We've spoken before about the way the Israeli state has compartmentalized the Holocaust as if it was a one-off event that never happened before, will never happen since. And I just wonder as well, Jackie, you can trace back your Jewish heritage, how you've experienced this this disconnect, I guess, with the kind of traditions, the positive, progressive traditions Graham describes, and where it would appear anyway in the British context. And of course, as Graham says, the Jewish community is as heterogeneous as any other community. But there does seem to be a drift towards some dangerous politics here.
Yeah, I think actually your mentioning of the Holocaust is somehow core in this discussion is really, really relevant, because this sense that the Holocaust is this one-off, extraordinary, unrepeated, never before situation that has this uniqueness that no other genocide has, is a really core issue. Now, I am not, by the way, denying that all sorts of particularities about the Nazi Holocaust in terms of the way that Jews were murdered and tortured and treated weren't unique. But of course, if you look at any genocide, there are always bits of that genocide that are unique to that situation. Uniqueness is part of, uniqueness and commonality are there in every single genocide that there is. And the reason for that is historical. These genocides don't happen out of nothing and out of nowhere. There's always some kind of political, material context for not just why they happen, why they begin, but why they are allowed. And we're seeing that now in front of us in live time with what's happening in Palestine. I mean, many of us thought we wouldn't see that kind of thing again. And we're seeing it, and we're seeing our politicians not only being complicit in it, we're seeing our economy put to the service of it. And suddenly you start to understand how it could have happened in Germany. And that in itself is a really important lesson for us to know. But of course, as a Black person and as a Black Jewish person, it's always been impossible for me, because I'm supposed to, in some way, prioritize one experience of genocide above another period of genocide. And here I am with a mixed ancestry. I have ancestors who were slave owners. I have ancestors who were slaves. I have ancestors who resisted racism. I had ancestors who embraced it, who were both Black and white. It is an impossible thing for me to do that. And yet what we see, and we're seeing this played out now, we saw it played out in this last Holocaust Memorial Day, is this insistence that memorializing Holocausts has to prioritize one above any other. And I do think, for example, that one of the things that has happened in terms of since October the 7th and what we've seen is that there are many, many more people who are going to be questioning what that's about and why we have to do it in that way, why we have to be, if you like, policed in that way.
It's interesting you mentioned every event of the kind we are witnessing now and that we've looked at historically on this programme, of course, has its unique features, but there's continuities there as well. And just thinking about Primo Levi again, he describes everyday, routine, mundane people he meets in the concentration camp at Auschwitz who undoubtedly went home, kissed their kids goodnight, had dinner with their wife after committing atrocities throughout the day. And it became, I guess, psychologically, it becomes normalised when the state is extending permission to you to behave like this, and has worked on you psychologically for a number of years. And I don't doubt that, again, it's a great tragedy that to compartmentalise the Jewish Holocaust denies Jewish people that international solidarity, that connectivity with other oppressed people that might be within their grasp and ought to be. I wonder, both of you, we've, I'm sure we've all been on one or perhaps and probably many more of these solidarity rallies that have been happening around the country, and they've been a really restorative. Personally, I've found it a nice place to be, to put it in a blasé way like that, where CLPs these days are very difficult places to be. I've taken the decision not to attend any more CLPs for the time being, because they're just toxic places to be. Do you see in all this energy, all these young people, and a very diverse numbers at these rallies? Disappointingly, yesterday, a very striking absence of trade union banners, and it was pointed out from the platform. But nonetheless, Graham, first, do you see something growing out of this politically that might, again, in hindsight, we can look back and say this was the beginning of something really positive and something politically significant?
It could be, Mike, is my actual answer. I mean, there's no doubt that since the kind of political avenue of the Labour Party is now largely shut down for the moment, although, by the way, there were about 3 CLPs recently who have passed very good motions on Gaza, but that's 3. Yeah, I mean, if you like, the centre of resistance is going to come from outside, within the trade unions, perhaps, subject to caveat you've just made, but on the streets. And the good thing about this wonderful thing about the fresh air of these demonstrations is the youth, but that still ultimately needs to be given a political expression, and that is the question we face. I just want to raise one other point, and maybe a slight digression, but let me just say, I don't ever accept this question. I'm glad you haven't asked it. How come the Jews who suffered so much are now doing what they do in Israel? Well, one, it's blaming Jews for Israel. That's wrong. But secondly, it's putting a higher kind of standard on Jews than anyone else. I mean, why not, I would say? Because one thing we've all learned, Primo Levi makes it clear, as you say, but lots of others, is that suffering doesn't ennoble you. You can learn from the lessons of defeat and tragedy, but not necessarily. And it's happened so many times in history that the oppressed become oppressors. It's the dialectic of historical development. And, you know, it's so I don't recognise that particular question.
Sure. And it's interesting you mention, again, just thinking of the literature, Jean Emery and others, that what was striking sometimes is the petty bullying that goes on within concentration camps, amongst concentration camp victims. So yeah, there's no essential and fixed outcome to human suffering, I guess. Jackie, what do you make of these rallies and gatherings which have brought a lot of optimism, a lot of hope, brought a lot of different people together? Is there a political outcome to that we can be optimistic about?
Before I go on to that, can I just carry on with that as a point? Because I was talking to somebody on social media, and it was an Israeli Zionist, and he was saying, you know, my grandfather was a Holocaust survivor. How dare you question me in terms of being a racist? And that puts it in a nutshell, doesn't it? And I said to him, right, so are you telling me that because one of your grandparents or 2 of your grandparents or whatever it was actually managed to survive the horror, that means you cannot be a racist? I mean, but actually, if you look at Israel, that is a lot of the justification, not even just looking at Israel. Look at what they call the Jewish community groups now, and that is what they're doing. They're saying, we can't possibly be the racist. But when I, as a Black person, see those demonstrations, and you see, you know, the EDL there, you see them, and they're waving not just the Israeli flags. They are waving the Union Jack. But not only that, it is overwhelmingly white. It is overwhelmingly white. It has all the characteristics of far-right organizations. Everything, even down to singing, you know, the national anthems of both Israel and Britain. Now, apart from the fact that for me, and I can't understand how Jews don't feel like this, you know, and I'm not saying some Jews don't, but both as Jewish and Black, any sign of nationalism like that scares the living daylights out of me. Because what that does is it says there are one group of people who adhere to this ideology, who are right and righteous and good. And there's another group and they're outside of that. And every time they have one of these demos, if anybody's on social media, you know, they'll plaster them there. And what they'll say, the commentators who are representing these demos, they'll say, can you notice we're decent people here? We're flying the flag. We're not like those people that you saw last weekend. And they are actually the proponents of this sense of purity. We are pure. We are well behaved. Now, anybody who goes to those Palestinian demos will tell you that I bring my grandchildren there for God's sake, you know, and the youngest one is 3 years old. I'm not going to do that if it was as was reported. Do I think it matters? I'm going to be a bit more optimistic than Graham. I think when you've got people like Greta Thunberg turning up, and she has got such an inroad into the thinking of very young people, when you've got that kind of youthful and diverse community coming together, I just don't believe that there's no payoff for it. I'm not saying it will be immediate, but do I think there's a payoff? Well, yeah, I do, because I also think about how and when I was brought into politics, and I was brought into, you know, it was the 60s and 70s. And in a way, what we're seeing now, I'm not saying it's like that, but there's a little echo. There's a little echo of that kind of youthful defiance to what the establishment, what the orthodoxy is doing and saying. And I've got to believe that that really matters.
To finish us off, guys, we should place the Palestinian struggle front and centre, I guess, for our last comments. Where do you see, this is a difficult question, I apologise for asking it, where do we see their struggle now? We have got a situation where, as we said, both you and Graham noted, Jackie, that even Biden, even Cameron are urging caution, and I think Biden quite explicitly said, do not go into Rafah, because that, that promises a bloodbath. And we are seeing the kind of movements around the world, and obviously the determination of the Palestinian people has been a humbling to watch every day and to hear at these rallies. Where do you see their struggle going? And perhaps, if I could, not only their struggle, but given the struggle of the Palestinian people has been a lightning rod for anti-colonial struggles around the world for many decades. I was looking at a wonderful speech by Malcolm X on YouTube the other day, back, almost half a century ago, more than half a century ago. Might their struggle be a kind of a litmus test for other struggles around the world? But first of all, where do you see the Palestinian struggle, given, I guess it's just to survive right now, but politically, once these events pass, as they will, where do you see them going?
Well, I kind of think that, I mean, if I'm being truthful, I think what we're going to see is, you know, they're talking about, you know, moving the people from Rafah to get them out of the way of conflict. Well, it's actual ethnic cleansing, and I think the Palestinians are going to be having a choice, which is to allow themselves to be moved to save their lives and to save themselves initially, or not. And it just blows my mind. It blows my mind. I don't even know, and I don't feel I have any right to suggest what they should do. And I don't think it's by accident that it's Rafah and so near to Egypt that this is happening either, because I think there has long been a plan on the table that actually what should be happening is that the people of Gaza should be moved to Egypt. I have no advice to give them except just huge sense of admiration for these people going through an unbelievable struggle, often with such dignity and such courage over so many decades. Where it will leave us in the future, I don't know. I mean, one of the problems in America is that you've got this being played out as a political football between the Republicans and the Democrats, you know, but actually it's not just that in America, it's also that in the UK. We have spineless, unprincipled politicians now. That's our real problem. We have nobody with that kind of moral dignity to kind of step forward and actually have the courage. Because Graham is right. If Biden did that, even if he couldn't, because of Congress or the Senate, cut off money, the moral authority that there would then be around the world would be enormous.
And Graham, same question to you.
Yeah, well, Palestine is the global issue of our epoch. And everything that Jackie said about the Palestinian struggle, I want to just say one last thing on that. What I think is remarkable is, in a way, the forbearance of the Palestinians, the fact that there have been so few October 7th. I think that is remarkable. And I'm certain that they understand that they're not alone because of the millions demonstrating. So can we build new alliances? Well, they're already being built. How will that happen? I think depends on what we do, partly immediately. We have to carry on that pressure and try to build alliances. And we've got to try to combine two things, which people on the left sometimes don't always get, which is to be absolutely intransigent on your political fundamentals of internationalism, universalism, standing by the anti-colonial struggle, full stop, no concessions whatsoever. And at the same time, to have an organizational, tactical nimbleness, to build alliances, to go places where perhaps we wouldn't go before. And I say that as someone who was in the Labour Party for 52 years, still think we should have an orientation to the Labour Party, but there are areas of resistance, of actually electoral resistance, which I will be supporting against Labour, publicly anyway, for the first time in my life. So we've got to be flexible as well as absolutely unbending on what really matters. And this civil rights, human rights, what's happening is just unconscionable. And if you're wrong on this, it seems to me that you can never really come back to any area of level of struggle.
Graham, Jackie, as always, it's been a pleasure speaking to you. We'll no doubt return, as we inevitably will, to these issues in future programmes. But for now, thank you, and comrades and friends at home, thanks for tuning in to Redline TV. Comrades, friends, we couldn't leave the events Jackie and Graham were describing without a brief postscript, a wee addendum from us. It's becoming a mundane truism to say that we live in dangerous, volatile, unpredictable times, but since we spoke, certainly that truism has been brought to the fore once again. So we wanted to hear what Graham and Jackie had to say about events in Rochdale. I guess you could guess that was coming. Extraordinary events. We're going to see an election that likely Labour is going to lose as a consequence of these events. So I'll start first with really we're just getting a summary, I think, an addendum to the conversation that we've just seen. So Jackie, I'll start with you. What are your thoughts about these unusual, shall we say, events in Rochdale over the past few days?
I have to admit, I had to really try and stop laughing all through the day for a number of reasons. One is, here we see the Labour right being hoisted by their own petard. Those of you who are not quite as au fait with this phrase as I am, what it means is that you've buggered yourself, really, because what they've done is given the Tories and everybody else who, you know, wants to have a dig at them, a wonderful tool. They can pull this out every time. And in fact, what we've seen is, I think the most recent thing today is that there is now pressure for every single councillor who was at the meeting where the alleged comments were made to also be suspended. Well, I mean, why would they stop there? Why wouldn't they go to every single member? And also, of course, that's been followed with another suspension of somebody who just said, fuck Israel. I mean, can you imagine? You say, fuck Israel, and you get suspended for that. I mean, you can see where this is going to go. So I think there's that. And there's also, in terms of Rochdale, I mean, the wonderful thing now is that the ex-official Labour candidate is basically saying he didn't mean the apology, and actually he was forced into it anyway. And this is the garbage that we're going to have now, is that people are just going to say whatever they need to say to keep being a candidate, but they're pushing again even more, because what they're saying is that they want an even better selection process. I am absolutely sure now that what's going to happen is that they will look through everybody's social media, and that if you have ever tweeted out in support of anything of Palestine, you will not be a candidate. It's extraordinary.
Thanks, Jackie. Graham, what is doubly extraordinary, as Jackie said, is that this right-wing candidate, Azhar Ali, who was, of course, pictured standing beside Jeremy Corbyn on Channel 4 News, the immediate ideological framing, what was wheeled into action yet again. But as Jackie says, not only has he reneged on his apology, he's encouraging people to vote for him as a smack in the face to Keir Starmer. It's just bizarre, absolutely bizarre. And I just, like all of us, and I'm sure our viewers, the losers in all this theatre are the Palestinian people and the people of Rochdale. Graham, what's your thoughts?
Well, of course, it's a farce. It is doing Labour no good at all, of course, because whatever happens at the by-election, Labour has lost it. And this comes after yesterday's by-elections, which, although portrayed as great victories for Labour, show very little increase in the Labour vote. And it just confirms the whole trend that Labour's going to win the next general election, but with diminishing mobilisation behind it, a very kind of there will be very little hope of change and very little movement behind the Labour government. And of course, it would need it if it were ever to make any fundamental difference. Now, look, let's just go through what this candidate said or didn't say. I'm not interested in what he said about Israel. He's entitled to his views. I tend to agree with him on most of what he said about Israel, except the fact to say here that Israel allowed it to happen is not words I would use, but so what? It's not surprising he gets the confusion between Zionism and Judaism wrong when, of course, the Labour leadership and the whole narrative is actually saying the same thing. But much more important, fancy people making such an issue of wrong words, however wrong they are, when the majority of the Parliamentary Labour Party are actually actively supporting ethnic cleansing by going along with Starmer's refusal to call for a ceasefire. Now, there's going to be a lot of talk about Galloway here, but the main issue isn't Galloway, it's Labour and Starmer that stand in the dock. Now, as for Galloway, we're in a bit of a quandary, I think. On the one hand, I'm certainly very conflicted. Galloway is no supporter of the left on so many fundamental issues, on women's rights, on asylum rights, on climate change. He's been pretty weak. And then you've got the farce at the European elections of him supporting the Brexit party. So no supporter of the left. The problem is that despite Ali's recent statement disowning Starmer and actually disowning his own apology, this will still be seen as a plebiscite, a referendum on Gaza. And for that reason, many on the left will actually be putting their cross behind Galloway. A very poor representative for us, but nonetheless, I think that's what could happen, but we shall see. Either way, Galloway or Ali, it's Starmer who loses, and it serves him right.
Yeah, the poor people of Rochdale are looking at a confederacy of dunces, aren't they? It's a tragedy for them, as well as the political landscape more generally. Comrades, thank you so much for your time. We've said it before, but we live in a time of monsters, and Rochdale is going to get its fair share over the next couple of weeks. Keep watching Redline TV. We'll try and navigate you towards some kind of clarity in these crazy times, comrades and friends. Thank you for your time. Comrades, friends, we couldn't let Jackie and Graham go without a brief comment, a postscript to our chat that you've just seen. Events have unfolded in ways that probably even Graham and Jackie couldn't expect in Rochdale. This week, we recorded the discussion you've just seen almost exactly a week ago, and in the intervening 7 days, obviously events have come to a head in Rochdale in, as I say, very unexpected ways, even perhaps for the most cynical of us. So I'll start, Jackie, with you. What's your take on what has happened since we last spoke?
Oh my God, it's just like so much happens. I mean, it's really hard to pull it all in and to make sense of it all, you know, because you've had the results of the by-elections, and then you've had disclosed in that, haven't you, as well, this relationship between one of the companions, one of the candidates, and his partner, and who that person actually is, which is a bit disturbing, you know, because this is his partner is not just somebody who served in the IDF. He served in a particular kind of espionage position within the IDF. And that, of course, for those of us, and there are many of us, who believe that what's going on at the moment is a genocide, of course, that's extremely disturbing. So that's happened. But of course, we have the fact that vote, you know, I think there was Labour actually increased their vote by something like 130 votes. I mean, it's astonishing that they're not doing better. And I think that is a really, really important issue that we should speak about generally, that given that Labour's got everything on a plate at the moment, that they're actually failing to do better in a lot of places. We've also got the fact that Netanyahu, of course, as you'd predict, is totally ignoring the please don't do this, guys. It's not very nice that's coming from the US and the UK and Canada and whoever. They don't need to listen. They've just been paid billions in terms of supporting this genocide. Why would they need to listen? And of course, this response from our politicians. It's just a way of them settling what's happening to their voter base, which they're disturbed about. But that tells you that we also have the ability to leverage these people. They wouldn't have gone thus far had it not been for us coming out every week, being on social media, making it clear, spreading the word, doing whatever it is we do. So I think those things have become very clear in this last week.
Thanks, Jackie. That ended on a note of hope and optimism, which we've got to hold on to right now. This week, the Scottish Labour Party conference voted for an immediate ceasefire. I don't think that would have happened at all without the kind of pressure from below that you are describing. And it's no small deal for the leader of the Scottish Party to take a different view to that of the UK party. It is precisely what politicians at that level don't want to project as disunity, but Anna Sarwar has definitely felt the heat of the membership, the heat of the trade unions, but most importantly, the heat of a burgeoning movement at his neck. It's very difficult, and you tried nobly there, Jackie, to encapsulate so much going on within this microcosm of Rochdale that tells us so much about the world we live in right now. Graham, what are your thoughts?
It's funny at one level to see Starmer's corrupt elite faction turning on itself, devouring itself. There's shades of Stalin here. The latest, of course, refusing to support its own candidate, in effect withdrawing the whip before he's even in Parliament. Yeah. And it's funny at one level. You'd have to have a heart of stone not to laugh. But beneath that, there is something quite tragic. And it's this: there's a massive crisis of representation. Yeah. It's not just the left that is not represented, it's the whole of the Labour movement. We are now facing a massive crisis of representation. There's a political void. So, you know, people will have different views about Galloway. I don't particularly want to go into this. The main issue is Labour, its leadership, and the fact that we have to rebuild a political voice for Labour. Still, I hope from within, but if necessary, from without, and that movement will have to be built at the grassroots. So, yeah, it's funny, but I'm not gloating over what's happened at Rochdale, because this is a tragedy, and our political classes of both parties are failing to represent the progressive section, and a massive progressive section of this country. And we're seeing now what could be dangerous, by the way, which is a growing divide between the people and the political parties. And if our movement is not going to be represented politically, we know where that can lead, which is a lurch to the far right. And I'm very concerned. Yeah, I'm always lack Jackie's optimism, but I think we both have to try to be optimistic and determined, but to recognise the scale of the danger we're facing.
Thanks, Graham. And you're quite right. A wiser head than us said it many years ago: one system is dying and another cannot yet be born. And we really do live in a time of monsters. One note of optimism we might want to finish on is that Starmer is looking to discuss the SNP amendment, the SNP motion that they're tabling for an immediate ceasefire. Again, Starmer would be dismissing that out of hand, were it not for the pressure that we are building from below. So there are, in this morass, and of all the horrors that we're seeing in Gaza, there is hope, as always, and it lies with ordinary people and the movements we can build. Graham, Jackie, thank you so much for that postscript. No doubt within 24 hours, events will have overtaken us again in this mad world that we live in. But comrades, keep fighting. We'll see you next time.